Do-Dodonpa at Fuji-Q Highland is unanimously considered one of the most intense roller coasters in the world, and that's because of one insane element, the record-breaking launch. Do-Dodonpa is an S&S compressed air launch coaster with the world's fastest acceleration. You go from 0 to 112 miles per hour in just 1.6 seconds, meaning you pull 3.3 Gs in the launch. Compare that to a hydraulic launch. Hydraulic launches are lauded for their intensity and rapid acceleration, but even those coasters can't come close to matching Do-Dodonpa's launch. Stealth is the fastest accelerating hydraulic launch coaster, going from 0 to 80 miles per hour in just 1.9 seconds, meaning it pulls 2 Gs on the launch. That means Do-Dodonpa's launch is still over 50% stronger than the best hydraulic launch out there. That's absolutely insane. And that just goes to show there really isn't another launch out there quite like Do-Dodonpa's. And this coaster has a really interesting history. Do-Dodonpa opened late in 2001 as just Do-Dodonpa. The steel coaster was the second compressed air launch coaster from S&S after Hypersonic XLC. But most notably, Do-Dodonpa stole the speed record from the now defunct Tower of Terror at Dreamworld and Superman at Six Flags Magic Mountain. Both those Intamin coasters reached a top speed of 100 miles per hour, although many will debate just how fast those rides really traveled, but that's a different story. Do-Dodonpa reached a top speed of 107 miles per hour, and just because I like showing just how intense Do-Dodonpa's launch is, I want to point out that Superman takes 7 seconds to reach its top speed of 100 miles per hour, so Do-Dodonpa accelerates roughly 5 times faster. Do-Dodonpa held the speed record for 2 years until Cedar Point built Top Thrill Dragster, which accelerated riders from 0 to 120 miles per hour in 4 seconds. Again, that's an impressive acceleration, but Dragster still takes twice as long to reach its top speed than Do-Dodonpa. So while Do-Dodonpa lost the speed record, it retained the acceleration record, and honestly, I'm not sure if it'll ever be broken. This launch in Do-Dodonpa is downright insane. And as crazy as Do-Dodonpa's launch was when the coaster originally opened, would you believe me if I told you it got even stronger in 2017? Believe it or not, it did. In 2017, Do-Dodonpa was renovated into Do-Dodonpa, and there were 3 key changes. 1. Do-Dodonpa's top hat was removed in favor of a giant 161-foot tall vertical loop. And I was sort of bummed to learn the top hat was being removed. Many called the airtime on Do-Dodonpa's top hat one of the most intense airtime moments in the world, and it's not hard to see why. When you have a coaster traveling as fast as Do-Dodonpa with such a sharp crest on that top hat, you have the recipe for some thigh-crushing ejector airtime. Even some enthusiasts said this airtime was a bit too much for them, so I sort of understand why the park decided to replace this element with a more comfortable vertical loop, but I still am curious how that top hat would have ridden. This loop necessitated a second change. In order for the train to complete the circuit, the eye-popping launch had its power increased. Do-Dodonpa originally accelerated guests from 0 to 107 miles per hour in 1.8 seconds. Do-Dodonpa accelerated guests from 0 to 112 miles per hour in 1.6 seconds. So not only was the top speed increased, but the time to reach that top speed decreased. So the launch got roughly 17% stronger. That's absolutely crazy. Third, Do-Dodonpa's lap bars were replaced by bulky, over-the-shoulder restraints. And I'm bummed this change was made since the old trains looked so much more open with the lap bars, but the over-the-shoulder restraints thankfully don't cause any discomfort. They just detract from the visuals in my opinion. One of the biggest flaws with Do-Dodonpa, and many rides at Fuji-Q Highland for that matter, is the coaster's capacity. Do-Dodonpa runs 2 trains and each train seats just 8 people. That's extremely low for such a signature attraction at a park as busy as Fuji-Q Highland. Thankfully, the ops are pretty quick at dispatching trains. There just isn't much you can do when the train holds so little people. As a result, this coaster can get a brutally slow moving queue. I've heard stories of it reaching upwards of 3 hours even on weekdays. So you have one of 2 options to beat the crowds at Do-Dodonpa. 1. Line up at the main gate before opening and head straight to Do-Dodonpa. Do-Dodonpa is located near the south entrance, so it's one of the first rides you'll encounter. 2. Buy some skip the line passes. This option does get pricey, but it's the best way to guarantee yourself multiple rides in Do-Dodonpa without wasting an entire day in that queue line. Like many parks in Japan, you cannot choose your own row in Do-Dodonpa. Thankfully, I did get one front row ride, but I have to be honest, I didn't notice much of a difference between that row and other rows. Typically, the front row is the de facto best seat on a launch coaster, so you can appreciate the speed in full. There's nothing quite like having your cheeks power blasted by the wind. But Do-Dodonpa's trains have a windshield in front, so you don't get that effect up front. Another thing to note is that you'll have to empty everything from your pockets. This is another common occurrence on coasters in Japan. The ride has free lockers in the station, and they admit groups into the locker area before the next train arrives, so this process works quite well. It costs no extra money for guests, and it doesn't slow down the operations. Once seated, you slowly roll into this dark, corrugated steel tunnel. At this point, you'll hear the ominous echo of the compressed air tanks being filled. It's a similar sound to what you hear during the pre-launch sequence on an S&S launch tower, except Do-Dodonpa's launch is far more intimidating. You come to a stop and the anticipation mounts. You'll hear a series of drum beats playing on repeat. Then all of a sudden, you hear an excited voice scream, "Launch time!" And yes, this exclamation and the subsequent countdown is in English, oddly enough. You're then counted down from 3, 2, 1, and then the launch happens. And words struggle to describe this launch. On most launch coasters, it feels like you're being pulled forwards. On Do-Dodonpa, it feels like you're rammed in the back by a semi-truck careening out of control down the highway. It doesn't feel like you accelerate in this launch. It feels like you instantaneously transport from a standstill to the max speed. You accelerate faster than your body can process what just happened. I'd say my stomach dropped on the launch, but it felt more like I left my body behind in that launch tunnel. The launch truly is an out-of-body experience. And this is all accompanied by the deafening explosion as you burst out of that launch tunnel. Few coaster moments genuinely scare me, but Do-Dodonpa's launch is one of them. The sheer power of this launch is breathtaking, and the lead-up only increases the intimidation factor. So without a doubt, this is my favorite launch on any coaster. But what does Do-Dodonpa do with all that speed? Unfortunately, not as much as I would have hoped. Most of the ride is a giant, high-speed loop around the park. And sadly, the route is pretty flat. There are no hills for airtime, and the path is pretty linear outside of one far turn that is taken so gradually you have hardly any sensations. The ride is also quite bouncy, and that's probably explained by the wheels. One of the most distinctive features of Do-Dodonpa is the fact this coaster uses rubber tires. So you shake and bounce quite a bit, especially on the far turn. I wouldn't quite call Do-Dodonpa rough, as the tires absorb the shock quite well, but Do-Dodonpa is far from a smooth ride. The only element of note on the course is the aforementioned vertical loop. And this loop is quite good. Its massive size means that you navigate quite slowly at the top, so you get quite a bit of hang time up there. And it rode considerably more smoothly than the rest of the coaster, presumably because it's 16 years newer. Launch to brakes, Do-Dodonpa takes roughly 34 seconds, but it just feels like the coaster meanders for much of that time. So what would I rate Do-Dodonpa? I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Almost all of those points are for the launch. That launch is every bit as good as people say. It truly is one of the wildest elements on any coaster, and it needs to be on the bucket list for any coaster enthusiast. I think the fairest ride to compare Do-Dodonpa to are one of the giant Intamin hydraulic launch coasters like Top Thrill Dragster or King to Ka. I think Do-Dodonpa narrowly edges these coasters out in the launch department. Do-Dodonpa's launch is far more forceful, but the windshield up front is sort of a buzzkill. But I'd much prefer the giant top hats on the Intamin creations over Do-Dodonpa's loop. When you have a coaster traveling this fast, I think it's a waste not to climb a towering hill to get some airtime, astounding views, and use the ride speed in full. For that reason, I do prefer Dragster and Ka over Do-Dodonpa, even though Do-Dodonpa has the better launch. So while Do-Dodonpa's launch is exceptional, I found the rest of Do-Dodonpa a bit lacking. But that launch alone makes this coaster worth experiencing. What are your thoughts on Do-Dodonpa? Is the world's fastest accelerating coaster on your bucket list? I would love to hear your comments down below. If you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate if you gave this video a like and considered subscribing, because we'll have a lot more roller coaster and amusement park videos here at Canopy Coaster. Thanks for listening.